What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
Welcome back to another episode, you beautiful bastards. We have a fantastic guest this week. Jerry, who are we talking to this week?
This week is somebody, I would say, very different from the conversations that we've had in the past. This is Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis, and she's here to talk to us about something that's been big in the news the last couple of years, and that is racism.
Yeah, we had it's a difficult conversation to have. For those of you who don't know, Jerry and I are both white as fuck.
Yeah, we are.
So we don't have any knowledge here. But again, as always on this show, we want to have the conversations that people don't want to have. You know, I feel it helps people. Apparently not everyone feels that way.
I would say you guys are going to probably hear the discomfort because Grizz and I are literally the exact opposite of our guest. So we don't know where she's coming from, because we've never experienced that. And it kind of shows in the conversation. We were uncomfortable at times, but that's what it takes sometimes to get this, this kind of thing rolling.
And this week's editing, I would take out the pauses so you guys aren't sitting there in silence. I left some of them in because it just kind of adds to the conversation in my mind. It lets you know where we're at with everything and that the fact that we're not just boom right back with a response. So without further ado, hopefully you guys enjoy the episode.
So on this week's podcast, we're talking to Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis. She's an activist, educator, sociologist, and criminologist. And I'll let her introduce herself a little bit. Dr. Kimya, how are you? Thanks for being on the show.
I'm doing well, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
So yes, I'm Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis. I am a Black woman with a disability, born and raised in the second capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And I am an activist, sociologist, criminologist, educator, and founder of 365 Diversity. So I'm really excited to speak about racial issues and honest dialogue. So I'm excited.
That's great. We are too, actually. So I guess my first question is going to be, this is probably obvious, but it's been up for debate for the last, a couple of years now. Do you think that there's a racism problem in America?
Did you really ask me that question?
Yeah.
Rewind.
Now, I know that there is. So, what we're trying to do is there's a lot of people, as you've seen in the news, who are saying that there isn't an issue.
Okay.
I know that Andy and I know there is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we haven't experienced it. So if we are saying things that could be considered incorrect, we're open to be corrected. That's why we're trying to learn how this all goes.
Always.
Yes. So I do the challenging dialogue in which I'm not afraid of offending white people. So I'm ready for that. So
that's great. We're not afraid of being offended.
So the people who say there's no racism, they tend to be white people. And the people of various racial and ethnic identities who are not white tend to say that because they have decided that life is about assimilating as much as possible into whiteness. So when people say America is not a racist nation, the world is a racist world. So we got to pull back to 529 years when this land was initially stolen by Europeans. And that's the origins of white terrorism. We'll talk about the stealing of the land from thousands of indigenous cultures and identities of people who were stolen, raped, murdered. And then, of course, that led into transatlantic slavery from the continent of Africa, which built up the Western Hemisphere and made it completely different than it was for thousands upon thousands of years before all of that happened over the centuries. Racial categories were created around about 16th century, racial categories created by white men in particular, with support, of course, European whites. The whole idea of creating racial categories was to lump tens of thousands of years of people from billions of people from all these different cultures, ethnicities, religions around the world and throw it into these narrow categories, very narrow categories. The categories have changed a little bit over the last 20 years, especially when you're looking at it in terms of research. But that's also one of the reasons why people started using the word diaspora. Diaspora means that there are various nations, there are various ethnicities, religions, languages that are encompassed in different categories. And so, for example, when I was still a full-time professor, I taught race and ethnic relations, and some of the students could not handle a course where we didn't just talk about white supremacy the whole time. You actually had to learn the origins of the different racial categories. So you had to learn how Irish became assimilated into whiteness, how Italians became assimilated into whiteness, what it meant when initially white supremacy was about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants escaping Britain. And the idea was we're going to escape that and have our freedom, but our freedom requires us to kill indigenous people and enslave Africans. Right. So I always tell people, this is tens of thousands of years of humans who, many of whom, humans have never been able to just coexist with different identities and categories. Humans have always noticed categorical distinctions, whether it's physical, verbal, or anything. And humans have never known how to just let categories coexist. Humans have always had to rank categories. And with ranking, there comes power, prestige. And so it all goes into it. So when people say, is America racist? The world is racist because white people rule much of the world. And that includes parts of the world where there are no white people there. How do they rule parts of the world where there are no white people there? Through school systems where you can go through and even get a PhD. And all you know is that white people created basically everything that's worth knowing. And that's also the form of white terrorism that I address in my work.
Now, when you say that you had some students who were uncomfortable with the idea of learning about white supremacy, was that specifically white students that typically had an issue with it?
Well, they were not uncomfortable with white supremacy. They were uncomfortable with learning about race and ethnic identities because they had gotten accustomed to, when you talk about race, it is synonymous with racism. And all you got to do is say white privilege and the conversation is over. And race is not synonymous with racism. So me being an African Black woman, it's not synonymous with slavery. I come from tens of thousands of years of sciences, mathematics, knowledge, arts. So you're not going to reduce me to being imprisoned by white people. We actually have so much more knowledge beyond that and before that happened. But a lot of students had never been taught that. So since elementary school, they have been taught that you only learn about white people unless you want to talk about, transatlantic slavery, or if you want to talk about Japanese being forced into camps, if you want to talk about the Holocaust, if you want to talk about, the Trail of Tears, that's the only time they learned about people who were not white. And so I had to teach them. There's actually research about how whiteness was created. And unfortunately, some people, when you talk about how whiteness was created, they think the only way to get rid of racism is now to get rid of whiteness. And there are some of my colleagues in sociology believe that. It's generations of research. And I say there's no such thing as getting rid of any racial category. We always talk about colorblind racism in sociology. Colorblind racism is white people, despite creating racial categories, white people have a tendency to say, I am the race neutral expert and spokesperson for every topic, right? You'll hear white people quite often say, well, this has nothing to do with race. This has nothing to do with race. And so I tell people, if you think that getting rid of race is the only way to get rid of racism, you're going back to that falsehood that now white people are going to be robots. And that will further the falsehood that white people can now be the race neutral experts for every topic.
Now you've got me wondering, because I've never heard anybody say it this way in terms of when you say where whiteness came from, because I was born white. So it's not really something I ever thought about. Where exactly does it come from?
Yeah, so actually, a white man created racial categories based on physical features. So when I teach race and ethnic relations, one of the top markers for racial categorization is physical identifiability. And it gets more complex because around the world, you have billions of people for tens of thousands of years, different physical features. Like I'm Black, but I have family who are the beautiful shade of my shirt. And I also have family who could pass for white. Why? Because of transatlantic slavery and white boys and white men raping African girls and African women. But identifiability was initially the one way that the white man said, okay, especially when looking at Africa, these particular people could go into this category. And of course, it varied by the region of Africa, because Northern Africa now is considered more lighter shade when you look at Egypt, for example. And so race is not biological, neither is ethnicity, neither is language. So I also tell people, sometimes I hear people say Caucasian, and I say do not use Caucasian as a racial category. Why? Because that is back in the day when they considered there to be three categories: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. So Negroid are people who would be considered immediate descendants of Africa. And Mongoloid was people of Asian diaspora, Aboriginal, and Caucasoid was part of that, which is where Caucasian comes from. And whenever people say Caucasian in reference to white people, I say, unless you want a white person to call you Mongoloid or Negroid, let go of Caucasian as well.
I never even heard of that. That's incredible.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's interesting. I've never heard that before. So to get through these barriers, what should we use instead?
I mean, white people. Whenever I do work, I walk into the room and I say white people. And people are like, why you say that? Yeah. I say, because most white people have been taught that everyone else has a racial identity but white people, in a sense. Most white people are taught all their lives since childhood that race doesn't matter. And the problem with that, and you can, like, if you watch the CNN show, the 1960s, where it had a series of showing mostly white people in the 1960s, they show like the hippie episode where it's like white people high off of, substances,
whatever.
Yeah. Soup kitchens, helping the community. But conveniently, that episode did not show the Black Panther Party's free food program that also was given to poor whites. And a lot of times people will talk about class divide, like socioeconomic divide, but they won't talk about how race and socioeconomic status are directly connected. Like there's a reason, no matter where you go across the nation, if you go into a wealthy neighborhood, most of those people are going to be proportionally white. When you go to poor neighborhoods, it's going to be disproportionately Indigenous, Black, and non-white Hispanic, non-white Latinx. And with some poor whites represented, but poor whites tend not to live in predominantly areas that are Black, for example. So when people say, how do we learn? First of all, we can't tell families how to raise each other. Like, that's a big mistake when people say parents need to teach their children. That's just not going to happen, right? But what does change are schools. I specialize in curriculum development. I did that when I was a professor, when I created an academic program. I have collaborated with schools and public schools. The majority of public schools in America, you can say Canada as well, in parts of the world, they don't really want to change. Like they'll say theoretically, we want to change something, which of course is where the critical race theory comes in. And I tell people, don't just tell me a concept. I don't want to hear about one theory that you've become a fan of because you saw a hashtag on Twitter. None of that is important. Unless you're going to look at the annual assessments that librarians do, because I also was in charge of the accreditation component of my program for 9 years. Therefore, I was able to tell librarians what materials to remove and what materials to put in there on behalf of my department. Same thing happened when I created courses, when I hired faculty to teach the courses. So the same thing happens when we're talking about K through 12 public schools. It's very straightforward. It's exactly what it sounds like. It gets complex because school officials, they love to do things like professional developments. But when we say, okay, let's do it, Then all of a sudden, they pretend the decision makers really are the politicians. And then everyone pretends that they're not the ones making the true decisions. And then they'll say stuff like, well, the taxpayers don't want this. When they say that, they're usually talking about white people.
But I mean, like in that scenario, I'm not saying that they don't make the decisions, because they absolutely do. But usually the decisions are almost made for them because of funding, right? And I'm not saying that's right, because I think the school systems are broken largely because of this. But how do we change that? You know, you have to go to almost a federal level, because they're the ones deciding how you get the funding. And I don't know about down by you, but by us, it all comes down to testing. And they do all these tests that really don't judge anything. And now we have these curriculums that are either teaching nothing, or they're not teaching it the right way because they're teaching towards a test.
Right.
So it has to go to a federal level almost.
Right.
You know what I mean?
The government's
and how do you change those mindsets?
Yeah, the government's horrible because America is not as good of a place as Americans keep pretending. And so it's intentional, and we call that relative deprivation, where America's got some really horrible things happening for centuries, but we're told constantly to be grateful that we don't live elsewhere where things are even more in turmoil. And I tell people, we don't have to determine freedom and health services and so forth based on how we compare with other nations. And the same thing happens when you're talking about the school system. So there's always a different decision maker who can be challenged for changing the schools and learning about racial issues. The problem is that the teachers, the school decision makers, they're wonderful at distractions. Like now the distraction is critical race theory, which I tell people, critical race theory is based in centuries of African Black activism and social science. Therefore, the point is not just pushing in one theory. The point is, and critical race theorists would agree with me on that, the point is changing the whole curriculum. Because if you're learning critical race theory, but everything else you're learning still is about pretending that white people discovered most of the things that exist in the world, and curriculum tests are based on basically white knowledge, then critical race theory means nothing. I mean, you have people with terminal degrees, doctorates, teaching other people, and even people with PhDs, they tend not to be familiar with sciences, mathematics, arts, and literature that is not dominated by white people.
So both of us are from New England, and the first truly racist person I ever came across, it wasn't until I was in college, and he was from upstate New York. And what I learned there, by the end of that year, he wasn't racist anymore, because we kind of reality checked him there. We're like, why do you believe all these things you believe, right? But what it came down to, it was his family that had taught him these things. So even if you change the schools, and I agree you should, but if you change the schools and they're still getting fed that lineage from their family, we're still going to have a same issue, right?
Yes. Well, I don't believe in a such thing as focusing on racial bias. So whenever I see implicit bias trainings and conscious bias trainings, I tell people to stop, because you're never going to get rid of people's biases. You're never going to change. Absolutely, like whenever people say, police departments do this a lot. Police departments and medical providers, they boast about doing bias trainings, but I don't care about trying to read people's minds. I care about the outcome. The outcome is that police and medical providers kill people. People die daily. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, police should not be in existence as much as they are. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that their training and their education, all their lives, is based on a false universal standard of health. So I'm saying this as someone who created a crime academic program, and I created and taught courses about health, and I've done trainings for medical students and medical professionals. It's the same problem over and over again. They're so accustomed to being told that racism is about bias and prejudice. Therefore, they come to me and they're like, okay, if we all smile, then now everything's good. Right. People die while you're smiling too. So it's not about any of that. It's not about how friendly you are. It's about policies and procedures. It's about the fact that when people say there's a budget crisis, There really is not. The money is going someplace else. Taxpayers, and when we're talking about white dominance, white people who are taxpayers, including white liberals and white progressives, they could actually have a huge say-so in changing the curriculum. Like white progressive oftentimes ask me, what should we do to change the books in our courses? I said, actually, you all know what you could do. Like, if the recycling bin outside your house was gone, you would figure out who to contact, right? Same thing applies to when you're talking about school curriculum. You know that as taxpayers, you have so much power, but you only pretend to be without power when you're told to make yourself uncomfortable as a white person.
That makes sense. And actually, since you're talking about the diversity training, kind of not really doing much, Andy and I both have had to sit through all kinds of diversity training. And I think that we probably agree on this. Every time I'm sitting there looking at all of it, it just feels incredibly forced. Like they're doing it because, someone's watching them. They don't really care.
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like the attitude's different. I just have to sit there and watch an hour-long video that doesn't amount to anything.
Yep.
I equate it towards telling a smoker not to smoke.
And it's
they're not going to listen.
Exactly. The same thing happens when you're talking about racial and ethnic equity, where you're talking about LGBTQIA equity and rights, where you're talking about health services, reducing ableism. For every single category where there's underserved and minoritized people, when schools, businesses, and organizations and politicians do trainings, when they have committees, it really is fluff to just waste your time and pretend they're doing something. So that's why the work I do is results-based. I always tell people, I'm just sit here staring at me, because a lot of people staring at me are going to create, anonymous burner accounts and start emailing to harass me anyway. That's what people do when they can't say anything to your face, white people in particular. So I tell people, my work is based on changing your policies and practices. I don't care about your bias. I don't care about you telling me that you like Black people. I mean, my people have been murdered for centuries, including by people who say they have Black friends, right? So it's something beyond bias. And that's when people get really uncomfortable, when I refuse to celebrate people making money doing bias trainings. And I say, beyond the bias, what are the measurable outcomes? And that's when I show decision makers how to change policies and practices, how to do annual assessments. That's when people disappear, because they really just wanted a bias training. They really just wanted a training so they could say they did it. Everyone shut up now. And when you say
it's just the PR. Yeah.
Exactly. Just like doing official statements, right? The anti-racism statements after George Floyd was murdered, including when that was done in academia by schools, colleges, and universities. It's all the same routine. And as Black people, we're told for centuries to be thankful that white people are not killing us and be thankful that white people are issuing statements. Like literally, when white people stalk me, they'll say things like, well, you better be glad that, or, all sorts of things. And I tell people, that's actually how a lot of white people feel, including white progressives. A lot of white people think that they're doing us a favor by not harming us. And that's why I say this is not about bias training, because it's about power. It's about stolen and abused power based on race. White people are the power majority. Success is considered based on how white enough you can be. So that's why when we talk about things like language patterns, the idea is that me as a Black woman, I'm supposed to walk up into predominantly white spaces and talk white enough. I have locks, of course, but before that, I used to have a hair relaxer where my hair was nice and straight. White people felt very comfortable because I'm a lighter melanin Black woman with straight hair. The moment I started growing out my afro 10 years ago, and I started talking more honestly about being born and raised in the Second Capital Confederacy with Monument Avenue and Robert E. Lee statues and stuff, white people who initially said they were ready got uncomfortable, which is why I started developing this work to address the difference between theoretical and conceptual justice. because that's what happens when white people oftentimes welcome me into spaces. They're like, "Oh, you're an activist." Well, we are social justice oriented. And then when I start talking, they're like, "You hate white people." That's like the first resort. "You hate white people." And I say, that's like, cisgender men telling women they hate men because you're talking about gender equity. It's the same routine.
Now, do you think that we are headed in the right direction or the wrong direction as a country?
We're headed in the same direction that it's been for centuries.
So really, it's business as usual. Nothing seems to be changing for the better at all.
Yeah. People are very simple-minded in the sense that they want to pretend there's changes happening. Like schools and organizations, they do this. They'll say, "Dr. Dennis, we've done this. Things are improving." I says, "Well, show me your assessment. Have you done an evaluation? Have you done qualitative, quantitative assessment?" And they're like, "No." I says, "Well, how do you know things are changing?" Because people tend to be getting along more. They're getting along more because most of us have been taught all of our lives that white people will punish us if we don't just figure it out. That includes
and that punishment comes in many forms, like lack of opportunities and things like that, right?
Yeah, it includes that. Yeah, and this includes white people who are wonderful people otherwise. It's just that when you talk about power and what it means when you feel like your power is being taken from you, and examples include articles where people are talking about the white race is dying out. We talk about that in pronatalism work, like I'm child free. So sometimes you'll read articles about white people becoming child free. We need more white babies and all that stuff. It's similar to what happened for centuries in the United States of America with medical racism, scientific racism that taught Hitler how to do medical and scientific racism that Hitler and Nazi Germany used, unfortunately, for the Holocaust. It was all based on that same furthering Aryan blood. And so that's similar to what you see white people talk about a lot now with this threat that white people are being outnumbered and overthrown. But that's what I have to always remind people. Power is not always based on population size. You can look at places like South Africa, where white people are the population size minority, but still the power majority in terms of decision makers. Even if you don't see any white people around, right? You'll notice in the libraries, a lot of times white people's books are there. The publishers are white. So that's how power manifests. So it's more than bias. Instead, you have to actually inconvenience yourself and say, who are the decision makers? Even if we all sit around smiling, who are the decision makers?
That's a good point. Actually, this reminds me of, I've had many conversations with white people because Black Lives Matter movement is in the news all the time. So everybody has an opinion on it. And a really common theme that I hear is, well, in the 90s, it wasn't that bad. And actually, at first I was like, yeah, it didn't seem that bad. So I don't know what's going on. I didn't know, my first thought was like, well, why are they so upset? It was fine 10 years ago. As it turns out, it wasn't. It was just quiet 10 years ago.
Yep, that's exactly it. Whenever the power majority can always say it was not that bad, right?
Yeah.
White people will always say it was not that bad. But again, we're talking about 529 years of white dominance and white abuse that takes the form of school systems whose material is being presented as knowledge. It takes the form of medical and health services in which research still uses white people as a standard for the body mass index and the diagnostical statistical model when diagnosing people with mental illness. This is all still based on white people. So whenever people say it was not that bad when I was a kid, it goes back to that CNN 1960s series where when you look at the white people part of the show, they having some fun. Like even if you see the white hippies fighting the police, it's still like we're fighting for justice. And there are a lot of white people who literally all of their lives, they were taught that it was all la la land. And the Black folk just kept complaining, damn it. And there are white people who tell me that now. White people send me anonymous phone calls and emails harassing me, calling me racial slurs and gendered slurs and threatening to rape me. And one commonality is that we're just complaining because we're not grateful for being brought to the Western Hemisphere. And there's so much that goes into that. And that's an example of power, what it means when the power majority is told that they are in denial about facts. And that's what it is. I mean, white people are complaining now because not just critical race theory, but they're saying you're trying to change what's being taught. You're trying to change the facts. I'm like, but we were never really taught the full extent of facts, despite tens of thousands
they
of
weren't
years.
They weren't given all the facts. They were only given the ones pertinent to them.
And that's always gonna be the case, right? Humans, we're never gonna have a full span of tens of thousands of years of knowledges, but they're pretending it's not intentionally kept from us. Like it's intentional. Like even when we do curriculum development recommendations to schools, they know that the decision makers who are mostly white or afraid to lose their job by challenging white people are going to say, we can't make this change right now. So white people know a lot of facts that they see in museums, a lot of stolen knowledge from around the world. White people are not ignorant. When we're talking about changing power, we can't pretend that the people who have the power are clueless, because that's also a distraction that it's intended to keep us in these race relations trainings, treating grown adult white people like 5-year-olds, right?
Right.
And that's a huge distraction.
Andy and I have actually learned through the podcast now, because we're talking to all these people about all these different topics we never knew about, and actually having to research on our own. When you go back in, especially American history, a lot of the policy decisions, after we actually look into the background of what drove them, a lot of it is actually racism. Like things like the war on drugs, which we intend to go into that a lot in another episode in the future. Like a major driving factor for that was racism.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you end up in a situation where those are the people in power, and they also make the decision on the curriculum. So, of course, you're going to get what we have now.
And the people in power know who to hire. They hire people who are complacent and compliant, right? They're not going to hire revolutionary people. They're not going to hire activists, really. They're going to hire people who go with the flow and make excuses for going with the flow. Excuses include things like, I need to keep my job, I got to pay bills. Excuses include things like, change is going to happen, just be patient. As pertains to race, Black people in particular have been told to be patient for centuries. We were still told in 2021 to just be thankful for Emancipation Proclamation. Goodness gracious, that was a long time ago. We have to remember, after Emancipation Proclamation was Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the furthering strengthening of what we now call police departments. Police departments in the United States of America in particular, and Canada, originated because white people came together. They didn't have uniforms back then, but they came together to be like, okay, we can't control them in that way. Let's control them in this way, which includes still a lot of Black people working plantations, working in cotton fields. And you had to have essentially a card to prove that you were free. And after Emancipation Proclamation, it was Jim Crow through the schools and white water fountains. And so a lot of this is not in school materials. Like they'll get a history book that addresses a smidget of it, but you have grown adults who don't understand that despite what movie they've seen, slavery is still horrific. It was back then, but it has these after effects, just like the Holocaust is after effects. The Trail of Tears has after effects. Every group of people who has been harmed through a huge tragedy around the world and harmed for years and centuries, it doesn't stop just because that immediate harm stops. There's a trickle-down effect in terms of health outcomes, in terms of educational outcomes, in terms of workforce development, mental health. I mean, all of this shapes our lives. So when people tell us to stop talking about it, we don't have to stop talking about it. It doesn't mean we're confined in it, but we have to understand that the more people pretend these are not facts, and every few years they'll say, oh, we learned something new today. I'm like, Black people have been explaining this for centuries. So you're not learning something new. You're just finally admitting what you abused us for talking about for decades.
That's interesting. And one thing, because I went through your bio before we met, and one point that I thought was pretty interesting, which again, like many of your ideas so far, I have not heard before, you don't call individual white people racist,
Correct.
even though, as we now know, especially white people now know, the system is racist. But how can you not consider individual white people racist?
That's a good question. So every white person contributes to and benefits from white dominance. And the same thing if we're talking about cisgender people, heterosexual people. There's no such thing as being immune from privilege, power, and status. That can be if you walk into a grocery store quiet, not bothering anyone, and people might not bother you. Why? Because you're white, and they assume that you're going to be okay. I mean, there's all sorts of assumptions that people have based on this that can also be connected to socioeconomic status, right? So I have a PhD. Depending on how I dress, people can assume all sorts of things about me, whereas there's research for decades by social scientists where you could get a homeless white man, give him a suit, and people now assume the best of him in terms of education level and occupational status. So this is where, when I address how all white people contribute to the system, we want white people to understand this is not about politeness. You could be the most polite, loving person in the world. You could be married to someone who is indigenous, Aboriginal. You can have an occupation where you donate all your time to people in need. Yet and still, you're still white, right? It doesn't mean you have to be apologetic about your whiteness. Like I said before, you don't have to hide your whiteness, but you have to understand that being white comes with certain assumptions. It comes with certain opportunities. It comes oftentimes with people giving you benefit of the doubt, including law enforcement many times. And I don't call individual white people racist, although all white people contribute to racism. Why I don't call individual white people racist is because white people will literally waste your entire life having a debate with you about whether they are racist, right? Like you can go into all these different places and a white person will say, I'm not racist. And they always want to argue with me. And I'm like, okay. They get really mad because they're accustomed to many people, especially, Black people and oftentimes white liberals who will spend an hour telling white people how they're racist. And I always tell people, what did you accomplish from wasting your life on that, right? Like when we talk about sexuality and gender identities, there's no point in debating a cisgender person about whether they are cisgender centric. They are. Right. Why? Because most people live in cultures where cisgender is considered normal. Gender non-conforming, gender non-identifying are the people who tend to have to answer a lot of questions. So a lot of cisgender people don't realize that. Why? Because you're considered normal. You don't have to think about it. The same thing we're talking about whiteness and white people. A lot of times white people, they really want to not just debate with me, but argue with me about whether they are racist. And that's when I tell them, including school officials, I say, the fact that you're focused on proving me wrong is an illustration of white dominance. Mm-hmm. Like there's so many things you could be doing right now, like changing a curriculum, but your focus is telling a Black woman about herself and proving your point to a Black woman.
So from those same people then, because I've heard that same argument too. And one of the common things that I hear a lot of them say, especially younger people, is, well, my ancestors weren't slave owners. So what would you say to somebody in that situation? Have you heard that one before?
Oh, every day from my life. It's from the Second Capital Confederacy, remember?
Yeah, that's true.
So when white person told me that 2 days ago, my response...
Yeah, they use that as kind of a defense, right?
Yes, virtually and in person. Like I've presented at health conferences. And mind you, we're at a health conference talking about health disparities. And to make themselves feel better, it's very common for white Jews and white people from Ireland to come to me and say they're not white. And the white people from Ireland to say, well, my people were initially indentured servants. And I said, right. But if you read Ignatius Eve's book, How the Irish Became White, he explains how Irish assimilated, came to the United States of America, initially were considered white Negroes, lived in ghettos with Black people, started immediately after leaving boats, started using racial slurs towards us to prove to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that they were really white, despite, of course, Catholicism being considered outlandish. So that's how the assimilation into whiteness happens. So I tell white people, when you feel the need to come to me and tell me you're not really white, that says a lot. And when you feel the need to tell me my ancestors did not own slaves, I'm not going to have that conversation because, first of all, most of them don't know what their ancestors were doing, which includes parts of Europe where there were enslaved and abused Africans and Aboriginal people and people of Asian descent. When people want to debate with me about what their ancestors were doing, I tell them, I said, your desperation here, it's not proving a point.
To me, it doesn't matter what they're doing.
Right.
Like if your ancestors could have been the worst people in the world, who you are has nothing to do with that. You make your own decisions. Right. You know what I mean? You can change on how you view people in the world. You can change on how you treat people in the world. Now, you can see and look at your past and hopefully grow off of that. But it's interesting where people come from with trying to look like they're to give them an excuse like they're in the clear. Yeah. But when it comes to what you're saying with you take white people and because they're in a position of power, you want them to angle towards changing curriculums in schools. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it can't be everything. Like, racism is going to exist for as long as humans exist. Like sexism, ableism, all of these inequities and injustices, they don't go away. Whenever you hear people say, we've got this new law, like Biden signed this bill, whatever. I tell people signing a piece of paper does not mean it's going to be enacted. It doesn't mean that there's now going to be assessments of whether it was really enforced, right? So all this stuff is going to just keep going.
So that's the thing. How do we change?
But you do your role.
To me, like, no matter what I do in this world, I can influence the people around me. But you're always going to come across people that aren't going to change. They're set in their ways. Their parents did this, and they're constantly going to keep filtering that downward. And I can put all I want out into the school. It's still not going to change it. So to me, it comes down to each individual person changing the people around them. So how do you spread that other than what we're doing currently? You know what I mean? Like, I know that we have the U.S. has systematic problems when it comes to racism. And to change that, we have to change the way we think. And that's a really difficult thing to do. But we're at a time, like, it blows my mind that we still have these issues. But at the same token, humans are if the pandemic brought out anything, humans have not evolved much in the past several hundred years. And we're seeing a lot of stupidity out there, and people are not willing to change. They're not willing to listen to science. They're not willing to, they're getting more and more cult-like. They're falling into circles, and they're getting more rooted into what they already believe. So if anything, I'm seeing more of this stuff come out. You're going to see it in the news and stuff, but you're seeing more drastic things in that idea. You know what I mean?
Well, humans are revolving doors. So the things that you're seeing now have always existed. It's just, we have to remember that the internet did not always exist. Social media did not always exist. News outlets did not always exist. As a criminologist with a background in criminal justice, we explain this as it pertains to crime as well, right? Because people say there's been an influx of this type of crime. And I'm like, an influx based on when data first started getting collected, maybe 50 years ago. But that influx includes, there's still a lot of missing data. Like we have hate crime legislation based on hate crime data. The most prevalent hate crimes are racial-based hate crimes. White people are the majority of offenders for hate crimes. And it doesn't mean that all hate crimes get caught. Because it's all based on, investigation and all that thing. So we're never going to always know everything that's happening. So that's why I always tell people, you have to think about what are some things that you really want to primarily focus on. I always tell people, if you think you're going to primarily focus on changing your friends and family as pertains to racial equity, racial justice, you're going to probably realize that your family and friends are way more annoying than you were willing to admit all your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And that requires honesty. So like a lot of the white liberals, white progressives, and white anti-fascists who have spoken out against January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C., I tell these white people, your outrage is trendy because that's what's cool on social media. But the reality is that most white liberals, most white progressives, and most white anti-fascists, they probably know at least one of the white people who was there at the nation's capital.
You're saying they know them personally or just through lineage?
They could be both. I always tell people, when you're talking about power majorities, you have to be honest that a lot of people, they coexist for peace with harmful people. And the same thing.
What exactly, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but what exactly is a power majority?
So power majority, thank you for asking. I was waiting for y'all to ask that. Okay. So power majority pertains to who has the ultimate decision-making capacity. Okay. And we can look at that historically and currently. So you can look at public schools, even public schools that reach underserved racial and ethnic groups, indigenous, Black people, non-white Hispanic, tend to be still led by white people.
Right.
Okay. That could be school board, that could be the school officials, that could be the school counselors, that could be the politicians, the taxpayers whose money goes into it most. So they're considered power majority because they're the ones who are really in power. It doesn't matter who's saying what. But what I tell people is that you're not going to ever get rid of white people, the racial power majority, even though people keep saying United States of America will become more Black and brown, and they do like these population estimates based on race and ethnicity. That does not mean that white people will stop being the main decision makers when it comes to schools, medical health facilities, when it comes to police departments, workforce development, because even in medical facilities that have a large representation of people of Asian descent and people from the continent of Africa, these people still are trained since undergraduate degree and throughout their careers based on European white sciences. That's how whiteness remains the notion of knowledge. That's still power majority. And so we have at least one indigenous-based medical facility, and they are intentionally making it so that they challenge this notion that European white people created medicine. Because remember, tens of thousands of years of holistic medicine were not created just in white parts of Europe. And so these are the kinds of things that we discuss. And a lot of times people are really excited to start the discussion, but white people get uncomfortable throughout the discussion because they came into it thinking that if they smiled a lot, that they would just be considered polite, the world's a better place. And then, of course, the whole "I'm not racist," my ancestors didn't do that. I tell white people, you think that you're thinking of a really good comeback. Like you're like, I'm gonna get Dr. Dennis when I say this, but literally you're saying the same thing that white people have said for centuries.
Right.
So like that's the predictability. I can go into spaces and write down exactly what white people will say, whether they say it there or they create a burner social media account and say it to me via email. I can predict it. That's why I tell white people that's the power component. When you think you're really about to get me, but you're saying something that has literally been said to Black people and Black women for centuries. Like you think that you've had a gotcha, but it's typical such that many Black people are taught all of our lives what to expect from white people. We're taught that so that it can protect us from being abused and shocked throughout our lives. So a lot of times it makes white people angry because I'm not angry. Like white people want me to be threatened. They want me to be scared. They want me to be angry. And I'm like, why should I be threatened, scared, and angry over something that white people have literally said to African Black people for almost 5 centuries? Why would that be profound when we have centuries of Black activism and literature, sociologists who have written about this and have literally written about exactly what you just told me? Why would I be scared of you?
Yeah, listen, I don't think you should be scared of them. But to me, with what you're saying, how it's almost like it's unobtainable, right? Like, how do we get a point where everyone can live together and we don't have these issues that we have now?
That's never going to happen. Because I tell white people, when white people ask me that question, you just asked me, y'all need to have a town hall with a bunch of white people. Billions of y'all get together and talk about what are some things we're doing, because white people pretend cluelessness, but white people know how to interact with white supremacy. Mm-hmm. That's how you keep your jobs. That's how white people know what they're doing. So
yeah, I've seen it. I've seen that as well as in the corporate world, I guess you could say. Yeah. I don't come from the same industry as Andy, but I come from an industry before what I do now, where it was predominantly white. And of course, initially starting out, I never really thought about it. But I had seen Black people try to do the same job that I was doing. And most of the time they didn't get it. But I didn't find out until later on that it was mostly old white people that ran the companies I worked for. And they were, as it turns out, incredibly racist, sometimes openly when they thought nobody was around. It was a weird thing. So then it became really strange if I ever saw a Black person in the same role as me. Yep. So that leads me, after talking to you, to wonder, what can individual white people do to make the change? Is it just a change of mindset?
I mean, you can. So that's similar to what Andy just asked. So whenever white people ask those questions, I always throw it back at white people and say, what have you already been doing?
Learning. That's my first start here.
Yep. So again, when we're talking about power majorities do not need to be taught how to stop controlling and terrorizing everyone. And I tell this to everyone. LGBTQIA people do not have to give cisgender heterosexual people a tutorial. Like, that's like going to your murderer and saying, here's how to not murder me, right?
That's a good point.
Right?
But at the same token, like, you take the transgender movement, if it is something newish, right? No. Like, it's been around, but the amount of it's new. And so if you take the mass majority of the people and they have no clue how to deal with it, should they not be asking questions?
They should be getting.
You know what I mean? Like that's.
Yes. So transgenderism and gender non-identifying has existed for tens of thousands of years around the world. Right?
Yes, agreed.
Mm-hmm. So I always tell people, when something's new to you, just know that that's because you come from a culture in which it was intentionally hidden and the people living certain lives were punished and murdered, right, to hide it.
But so it's still new to you though. So in those instances, and people who don't want hate in their lives, they should be asking questions, shouldn't they?
Well, first you got to see what information is already out there, right? So let's think about this from a social media standpoint. People think that they found something on social media that means it's fact, which usually means most of it's not fact. However, there's a lot of actually legitimate information out there. Now you can do an internet search and there are lots of books that you can find. Some books are not accessible in libraries and schools. Why? Because people with very conservative views do not want certain factual information accessible. But that's where you can actually contact publishers. You can contact Black bookstores across the nation and locally. You can contact LGBTQIA organizations, particularly Black and Brown LGBTQIA organizations. Don't say, teach me this. Instead say, I'm actually looking for this book and cannot find it anywhere. Do you happen to know where I can find it? There's a huge difference between going to people empty-handed and saying, teach me, versus saying, I have spent weeks trying to find this. can you please help me find this book? The difference is that power majority has no ability to pretend that they are just clueless people who the underserved people should now educate.
But I mean, like, so we had a trans man on the show because we had never heard an interview with a trans person. And we thought, why is this? Right? And a lot of it is due to what you're saying is they people don't want to hear it or they don't put it out there. But for us, even with the research we did, we got so much out of that interview that we never would have thought of because I'm not a trans man, Jerry's not a trans man. And so it never came to us because it's not our life, you know what I mean? So for us to understand it, we had to have that conversation. We had to ask those questions. Yeah, we did research on top of it. But so my point is, I would think we should always be asking questions, even if they're difficult questions. They should always be asked, and we should always be having conversation, right? And always be talking about these things.
I think that questions.
You don't agree?
Questions should always be based on permission from underserved people. So you as a cisgender.
I was just going to ask what exactly that means because I've never heard it said that way before.
Yes. So people in power majority identities, such as cisgender people, if you go into an environment where there are transgender people or gender non-identifying people, you don't walk in there saying, hey, I'm cisgender. I'm here to learn. What will you teach me? Because transgender and gender non-identifying people should ignore your existence. That's the best way to learn and the best way to become an advocate. I don't believe in a such thing as ally. To become an advocate for people's rights is to know what it means to go into a space where you are underrepresented. You're the only cisgender person in the world in that space, and you are being completely ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that could teach them a good lesson, but I would think you'd also want to welcome them for trying to figure out as much as they can. No?
Nope, because power majority has to be humble to understand that we have to struggle every day for basic things. Power majority does not deserve to get access to basic things just because that's what they want. Like me as a Black woman, when I go into a space, like most white people have never been in a space where they're the only white person, and especially for long parts of their time. Even white people who have gone to historically Black colleges and universities are comforted knowing that the nearby police department is mostly white people and will rescue them if need be. Okay. So I tell people with power majority identities, white people as pertains to race, don't go into this space thinking that your existence has to be acknowledged. Like, don't go into space thinking that people have to explain anything to you because you're the power majority. Your discomfort in that space without people answering your questions, when you walk out that door and go back to your normal life, people are back to hugging you and welcoming you for existing. And I've had white women over the years who asked me, they came to Juneteenth events, which Juneteenth is the acknowledgement of when enslaved African Black people in Texas were told about the Emancipation Proclamation long after the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a white woman years ago who sat beside me and then she told me, Dr. Dennis, I would love to just come to your classes and follow you around. And so basically I was going to be her research base. And she thought that she could just follow me around and I'd explain stuff to her. And I told her, I said, no, I'm not the lab rat for white people. Like, if you want to learn some stuff, there's plenty of Black organizations, Black created events. Go into these spaces and be prepared for people to challenge you, for people to not explain to you. Maybe they'll give you a reading list. I've had white people over the years who they don't just want a list of readings. They now want me to give them the Cliff Notes because they knew they weren't going to read it. So now they're like, okay, tell me more about this book. No, you can read it. Okay. And even after you read it, that's still not life outside of the book, right? So that's why I tell people, no one has to explain anything to you. You might theoretically want them to, but think about this in terms of power. How is it really challenging your power if you can still tell people what to do?
So if
You saying when they go ask questions, they're telling people what to do?
Yeah, because when you're going into there not just asking questions, but actually expecting answers, and when you don't get an answer, you're like, well, how am I going to learn? That's going from curiosity to control.
Interesting.
So if a white person were to do a lot of the research on their own to, I guess, understand as best they can, because they'll never experience being black, and then they get a better idea of what's happening, what the issues are, how would they become an advocate at that point? Because we can't go in there and ask them the questions, because that's a power majority problem. If we were to learn on our own, how do we become an advocate at that point?
You just know that you're learning. Learning is a lifelong process. It never stops. We have thousands of years of billions of people, billions of learning materials. It's a constant process. And if you go into spaces where you're the only white person, remember that your arrival as a white person does not mean you are the expert. It's very common for white people to come to spaces, including George Floyd protests, and considering themselves the most logical person. Like, I've literally had white people come to me over the years, and they thought that they were the most rational person because, you know, we were a bunch of angry Black people because of police violence. And now here's the unemotional, rational one who just has logical questions to ask. And there's no such thing as a logical, rational human being who is void of emotions. This does not exist. But power majority allows certain groups, just like you hear men oftentimes will say, you know, men are rational, women are so darn emotional. Well, guess what? All humans are emotional, right? It's just a difference in how you express it. Duh. But that oftentimes happens with white people as well. White people, it happens with educators, white researchers. They really think, because they've been taught all their lives, that race is not a white people problem, as though white people do not have a racial category. And so this is a process that Indigenous people, Black people, for example, learn throughout our lives, because many of us thought we were going to teach white people, not just when we were professors and teachers, but we actually thought we were going to teach our white friends, we're going to teach white people in organizations. But we learned we were actually doing free labor as well. Like, you got white people who get paid tens of thousands of dollars to do diversity trainings. Those of us who are actually trained based on centuries of work are oftentimes doing free labor because we think that's our community outreach. And we have to find a way when to stop. You have to learn that when white people come into these spaces, you don't adopt the white person and be like, hey, you're now going to be my friend. Instead, you can have a conversation, be like, hey, how you doing? Shake hands, all that stuff. Not during COVID, don't shake hands. But, meet each other, talk to each other, but make it clear that I'm not now your teacher. Right. We can get to know each other, but the onus is still on the white person to say, I'm curious. I got so many questions, but before I ask these questions, let me go do my own learning. And the own learning is based on making yourself uncomfortable. You're going to say dumb stuff. You're going to say things that make you uncomfortable. You're going to say things that might get you cussed out. That's part of life.
Absolutely.
Literally, that is literally part of life. I think back to when I was a child and we used to watch the Phil Donahue show in the 80s and the 90s. And Phil Donahue and back when Geraldo Rivera was cool, they actually had these conversations in which they would have white people on the show, and it was usually white men in particular, but also white women would talk about things like reverse racism. This is reverse racism. And Phil Donahue and Geraldo Rivera would talk about there's really no such thing as reverse racism. Like, it's just reversing what white people have done. That doesn't mean that white people are now being abused. It means that we're trying to reverse the harm that you have caused for centuries. And these discussions have happened forever. Like, I think back to my Black elder sociologists who tell me in the 1960s, they started doing these equity trainings with white people in which they were explaining basic information to white people. And they're like, 50 years later, white people are still coming to us pretending that we haven't been explaining this for 50 years. So this is where we have to make white people uncomfortable and say, look, Black people have explained this. We've written books about this. We teach courses. We have entire academic programs. We have entire conferences. What is it about white people that it's too much to go out of your comfort zone and say, let me learn some stuff that is not cool for white people to learn?
So have you, yeah, obviously we've never heard that before. So have you had conversations that just got real weird and didn't go anywhere after that because they were then lost because they couldn't come to terms with that?
They weren't lost. They were angry white people.
They just got mad about it?
Yes, because again, remember we're talking about power. If you've been told all your life that you don't really have a race, that you're kind of like this race neutral expert for every topic, and then you've been taught all your life that these issues regarding racial identity and racial injustices really have nothing to do with you. And this is very common for white liberals and white progressives as well. When you've been taught that much of your life, and if you've done community activism work, people have been so excited to see you. Like, thank you for being here. You're kind of trained to believe that as a white person, you're kind of doing everyone a favor. That's what I call the white savior syndrome. And that's existed for centuries as well. So when you're not treated like a white savior, when you're in a space where people see you, but they're not like thanking you, they're not constantly explaining to you, it's a very humbling experience because people whose demographic identities give them power just for no reason are just not accustomed to being challenged in that sense. They're accustomed to people accommodating them because as Black people, this goes back to slavery. We had been trained that if we don't accommodate white people, we'll be tortured, murdered, raped. That includes what happens now in schools as well. And so white people just have been taught that all their lives. And when I say taught that, I'm not saying that parents have taught white children that this is what's going to happen. A lot of times, parents will not teach their white children that. Instead, white kids just learn it through interactions. They learn it by being around their families, by being around schools. They just learn that white people are considered the standard and are not challenged. And so that's why if there's a elementary school class that talks about slavery and not the let's do a role play version of slavery, but actually talking about what really happened during slavery for centuries, a lot of white kids get uncomfortable and start crying. Why? Because they were taught all their life that they will never be presented anything that makes them uncomfortable based on their racial identity. And that extends throughout their adulthood because many of us have been taught to not offend white people too much or else you'll never get a job, you'll never get through school, you might get killed, including by police, medical doctors. And so that's the routine. And my whole purpose is to challenge people's routine. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to get the point. That's not my goal in life for everyone to get the point. But it's for people to admit that even if they did not get the lesson, they were given the lesson. Choosing not to get the lesson is different than someone not handing you information. Difference between choice and lack of information.
Now, so we kind of have an idea of a better approach now as white people if you wanted to be in a position to help this situation, I guess. I'm not really quite sure how to say it now. Is there something that individual Black people should be doing too? I mean, you're an individual and you're a Black person and you're doing a lot of this education and outreach, but on an individual level, not everybody can be Dr. Dennis, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if is there something that individual Black people, just the regular citizens, should be doing as well?
Yep. So the work that I do focuses on Pan-African pro-Blackness, which is getting my people to access and learn thousands of years of knowledge, science, mathematics, arts, and literature that originated in the continent of Africa. And so I grew up in a household where my parents are both Black social scientists as well. So they actually taught us a lot of information that was not taught in our predominantly Black rich and public schools. And the whole idea is to change school curriculum. But while you're school curriculum, because schools will always have excuses for not changing, we also have to provide access to information to our families and communities elsewhere. So that's what I do. I specialize in providing educational resources. We have wonderful Black organizations locally, nationally, and internationally, increasing access to African knowledges and Black knowledges, which a full span, we're talking about a full span of thousands upon thousands of cultures. And also, we talk about different forms of medicine, holistic health. So I do collaborations with Black mental health professionals, Black suicide professionals, because I specialize in suicide as well, and Black physical health professionals. So there's a full span of all the work that's been going on. These are not new organizations. Those of us who are younger, I'm 43, we have to be familiar with the people who have done this work for centuries, for generations. A lot of these organizations no longer exist because, as you all know, organizations need money, right? And when white people do not want us to have organizations, what do white people do? They make sure there's no money. They make sure the government does not provide money. They make sure that grant funders do not provide money. They make sure that a building might get burned down, like all sorts of things that have happened for centuries with organizations. We commend organizations like NAACP that was co-founded by people such as Dr. W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. We commend them for still existing and having chapters across the nation. But we also realize that it has been difficult for many Black organizations to get that attention. And so I believe 100% in collaboration. There are too many people working hard for us to think that we're inventing something that's new. We got to always learn who's done this work long before you and connect, even if we don't agree on everything, but still connect. So the focus needs to be on connecting with each other. And we're talking about unifying across various racial, ethnic groups of people, but you can't unify across race if you're not unifying within your racial group.
That's very well said.
Well said.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Kimya, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we continue? Because we can talk as long as you want.
I know. I mean, this is such a good conversation. We could have like a series now. I think that I appreciate you having me on the podcast. And I think this should be a series of conversations because, as you all know, there are really people who have questions. And although I tell people to not answer questions to power majorities such as white people, cisgender people, instead to challenge power majorities to learn in their own time, this is where the follow-up comes in, though. This is where the follow-up is, where people say, okay, I've been learning more. Let's have a conversation of what I've been learning. Some of it is completely false because you got to remember, a lot of people
There's a lot of bad information.
Well, first of all, a lot of libraries do not have factual information. It's published information. It's not always the same thing, right? Yeah. So I tell people, if you're now complaining about the information that's accessible in schools and libraries, now let's go further and say, how do we change the information in libraries? How do we change information in schools? Which means changing the publishers, right? The publishers around parts of the world are mostly white and mostly white men. And a lot of times people criticize Texas for school curriculum development and the publishers being mostly in Texas. But I tell people that never will stop because you're still giving them money, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So now, along those lines, do you have a somewhere for people, like if people wanted to look for more information, do you have like guidance for them, like either links or areas that they should be looking?
Yes. So this happens a lot when I do presentations. People, like for example, I talk about how in schools we're taught white men in particular, version of mathematics, sciences, such that you can have a PhD in mathematics and you literally think that white men really developed the main types of mathematics. So it's very common for white people. Oftentimes they don't really want to learn. They think they're trolling me, but they'll say things like, well, how do we learn about African math, indigenous math? Literally, there are publicly accessible sites. If you go through internet search engines and you look up indigenous math, native math, African math, Asian math, there are some entire textbooks that have been put online that you can read the entire textbooks. Here's the caveat though. Even when you find there's an annotated bibliography of African mathematics books, pages, some of those books were written and published by white people and by Europeans in general. Why? Because when we're talking about stolen knowledge, sometimes when knowledge gets released, you learn that the only people who were allowed to publish the knowledge were white people, right? Because racism is based in 5 centuries of presenting white people as the only people who have legitimate knowledge and information. Therefore, a lot of times when we discover new information, the new information has existed for tens and thousands of years, but it only got credibility because usually a white man, but oftentimes white women as well, said, hey, I wrote this book. Like we have entire Asian medical centers, like they call it Asian medicine across the United States. And guess who's in charge of those centers? White men.
White people?
Right?
Yes, white men.
Yeah. And sometimes white men from other nations will be the chair of the department, will be the professors. So I tell people that I could always send you links. However, first I want to see what people can find on their own. And then, if we decided to have a conference or another podcast with the list of people's questions and what they've been reading, we could do that. But they have to just also tell people to research the demographic identities of the authors and publishers of what they find. So if they find a book, what's the name of the author? Google or internet search the author. Is the person of the ethnicity that they are writing about, or is it, again, a white person? And that's something that adds to the discussion of how knowledge is developed. And the same thing applies when we're talking about museums. There's a reason why museums are mostly owned and led by white people around the world. They will have things like indigenous skulls, African skulls, all that, and it's white people. So we are basically being researched and lab experiment by white people. Same thing when we talk about, Queen Elizabeth and all that. They have access to all that. So people can start looking this information up. I don't do free labor in the sense of sending people information, but they can start looking at information. And if they contact you all, I'll be happy to come back and people can say, here's what I've been reading. They don't have to agree with everything they've been reading because humans have always had fact and fiction. Sometimes you don't know the difference, especially like religion and sciences, but we can have discussions.
Thank you very much for being on. I really didn't know what to expect out of the conversation, but I'm very happy with the direction it went. I'm glad we could have you on and talk to you about it.
Yeah, I appreciate both of you, the honesty. Andy was like, but I want to ask questions, damn it. I appreciate that as well.
Before we end, did you want to put out your website?
Oh, yeah. They can go to 365diversity.com. Thank y'all so much.
Thanks for being on.
Bye.
Well, Grizz, that was not the most comfortable experience I've ever had. How about you?
Yeah, no, a little rough at times.
I'm glad we did it, though.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, I'm not going to shy away from a conversation ever. It's a little bit of a different viewpoint, but
yeah.
It is one.
So we tossed around the idea of how we were going to present this to you guys. But what we ultimately decided on, I think it was best for everybody, is we're going to just let you guys listen to the episode and come away with your own thoughts. And if you want to share that with us, get in contact. Tell us what you think of the episode.
This is probably the first one that Jerry and I had to really bounce around. I mean, we recorded this, 3 weeks ago now?
Yeah, 2-3 weeks now.
It's the first one that stuck with us that we really had to sit there and bounce around with how were we going to approach it. But we want to give you guys a good product every week and give you something that we feel is good to put out there. Take it as you will.
And that's that.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards Podcast. Please take a few minutes to give us a rating on iTunes. It's a major part of what keeps this smoldering pile burning. And it helps us keep the lights on so we can bring you new content. Remember, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, our website, anywhere else you stream your content from. If you enjoy the show, you can find all our links at linktree/beautifulbastards. Or you can check out our website, beautifulbastardspodcast.com. And now YouTube. Later.
Bye.